The destruction of the Challenger space shuttle was violent and devastating, yet somehow a single piece of athletic equipment survived. That's just one part of this tragic story that defies explanation. There's no way to know exactly what the last words of the Challenger's crew were. Nevertheless, there is an audio recording that survived the accident, although it raises more questions than answers. The official transcript of the audio includes a mix of what sounds like technical procedural talk and some glimpses of the crew's camaraderie. For example, Judith Resnick asks for a security blanket right when the recording starts. There's also a little bit of ribbing directed at Francis Dick Scobie by Ellison Onizuka, as well as some exclamations of delight. But 73 seconds after the launch came a chilling moment. Michael Smith saying "uh-oh" before the audio cut out. To this day, we can only speculate what Smith was responding to. Was there some sort of disaster in the cockpit, or was the pilot reacting to the explosion? Unfortunately, it's impossible to know for sure. There's been quite a bit of investigation into what the Challenger crew experienced in their last moments. It's widely believed that they survived the initial fireball and breakdown of the shuttle. It seems like the crew compartment separated from the rest of the craft, eventually entering freefall. But that still doesn't tell us exactly what occurred in the seconds following the catastrophic failure. Official reports explain that it was possible, though not certain, that the crew lost consciousness due to the high altitude and a loss of both cabin pressure and a steady oxygen supply. If that was the case, then they probably didn't regain consciousness before hitting the water at 207 miles per hour. However, the reports also raise the possibility that some of the crew members were at least conscious enough to activate their emergency air packs. To be clear though, those packs weren't made to provide enough oxygen at nearly 50,000 feet in the air. Then again, this is all just a guess, because investigators couldn't confirm that there had been a loss of cabin pressure. The violent impact into the ocean effectively erased any evidence they could have used to determine what exactly happened.
It's just devastating.
On the engineering end, the Challenger disaster was caused by a little piece of rubber called an O-ring. It was meant to function as a seal between different parts of the rocket boosters, but when exposed to cold temperatures, specifically anything below 53 degrees Fahrenheit, it couldn't expand properly or form an effective seal. That's what allowed gases to leak out and ignite, burning through the external tanks and causing the explosion. But here's the thing, none of this information about the O-ring's safe range of temperatures was discovered after the accident. Indeed, all of it was known beforehand. Not only that, but engineers at NASA contractor Morton Thiokol had explicitly warned officials about the dangers long before the launch. Thiokol engineer Roger Beaujolais even said that he wrote a memo to his managers a full 6 months before the explosion. His words eerily predicted exactly what happened, as he mentioned a catastrophe of the highest order and a loss of human life. But over the ensuing 6 months, nothing was done to address this potential safety flaw, and the mistakes go even deeper than that. In fact, there are no mentions of any such memo in official NASA documents. In other words, it's unclear how many people at the agency actually knew about the O-rings. How information like that just got lost along the way remains a mystery.
We were trying to look at the data and just make sure that it supported our decision.
The day before the Challenger launch was eventful, to put it lightly. NASA officials and Morton Thiokol engineers discussed for hours on end whether or not the shuttle should even launch. The weather forecast was calling for temperatures much lower than what engineers believed was safe, so they wanted to call things off to avoid disaster. According to those who were present, the conversation went in a somewhat strange direction. The engineers presented data to back up the recommendations, but NASA apparently didn't think this was decisive enough to truly convince them of the dangers. It seems clear that they wanted to launch on schedule, if the multiple hours they spent grilling the engineers about their concerns tells us anything. At that point, Thiokol executives made what engineer Roger Beaujolais called a management decision. They changed their stance and gave the launch a green light, just to satisfy NASA, and despite the engineers themselves being strongly against that choice.
We ought to say it's okay to launch.
NASA officials eventually came to question their own responses. For example, Deputy Manager Judson Lovingood recalled that after spending hours questioning Thiokol representatives about the reluctance, they didn't give their sudden change of heart any thought. As he put it, that was a mistake. We should have asked them why they'd changed their minds. When Norton Thiokol engineers approached NASA managers to recommend delaying the launch, they received some pretty cold responses. For example, Shuttle Program Manager Lawrence Malloy said, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" Clearly, NASA was anxious to get the Challenger off the ground, but the exact reason behind that urgency has never been clear. For one thing, it seems like the agency was dealing with some bad publicity. In other words, space travel wasn't cool anymore.
They should make it exciting. I don't know how they could make us all watch again. Maybe they should send up some guy that doesn't want to go.
The Challenger offered a golden opportunity to turn that bad press around in the form of Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher set to become the first civilian to go to space. Suddenly, the American public cared about space again, and NASA felt like it had to make the best of the opportunity. Then there were the goals that NASA had set for itself, specifically aggressive launch schedules to prove their reliability and that spaceflight could be a regular occurrence. Delays could ruin the reputation that officials were trying to maintain. There was also the possibility of political pressure. President Ronald Reagan was scheduled to give the State of the Union address that night, and the plan was for him to celebrate the Challenger's launch and even phone the astronauts during his speech. There were rumors that the administration had pushed NASA to go through with the launch. The White House officials vehemently denied that. Despite all this speculation, no one has been forthcoming with an exact explanation about NASA's thought process. Considering all the problems leading up to the Challenger accident, it's worth discussing the psychology of the people involved. If you're not involved in space travel, then you probably assume that it's not the sort of thing that should be approached carelessly. Or if you are involved with space travel, perhaps you feel that way even more strongly. But somehow, that didn't appear to be the case at NASA at the time. Was this a case of dangerous groupthink? That is to say, it seems that NASA employees just wanted to avoid disagreements, so they ignored the opinions of those they considered outsiders, like the Morton Thiokol engineers. Within that echo chamber, they may have also been dangerously overconfident. While several astronauts had died during missions, only one American had ever been killed in spaceflight, all the way back in 1967. There's also the possibility that NASA had simply grown accustomed to the problems with the O-rings. The agency had been struggling with the parts since the 1970s, so the fact that the Challenger's O-rings were a potential problem might not have raised any red flags, or at least not any that were out of the ordinary. The awful irony of this is that NASA really didn't learn anything. Safety standards did change on paper, but when the Columbia disaster happened in 2003, the same sort of management issues were to blame. The cause, once again, was a known technical problem, a risk that NASA just decided to accept rather than solve.
Both my company and NASA attempted to cover up what really happened that night before the launch.
The Challenger disaster led conspiracy theorists to come up with ideas that are pretty far out there and almost completely unfounded. But in the years immediately following the disaster, there were reasons to believe that there was a cover-up. The sporadic way that NASA released information about the crew's bodies had people thinking the agency had something to hide. But there were also incidents that called into question exactly what NASA and Morton Thiokol really prioritized. During closed hearings regarding the accident, a NASA official claimed that Thiokol had signed off on the launch despite concerns. But this was an oversimplification, one that engineer Alan McDonald felt compelled to dispute. As he argued, the explanation glossed over the fact that Thiokol's engineers had consistently fought to delay the launch. Furthermore, it was only an executive decision made under intense pressure from NASA that led Thiokol to give the green light. To McDonald, leaving out that detail felt like intentional deception, a way for NASA to hide the truth and protect itself from scandal. In the decades since, McDonald has been praised for his integrity, but right after he made his statement, Thiokol executives punished him with a demotion. That decision was eventually reversed due to congressional action requiring that Thiokol allow their employees to speak freely. But punishing someone for telling the truth isn't exactly the best way to quiet speculation about a cover-up. Here's a strange but true fact about the Challenger mission. Big Bird was almost on that shuttle. We kid you not. The iconic Sesame Street character was very nearly a crew member on the doomed shuttle. His spot was essentially given to Krista McAuliffe instead, although the full details of the story are hazy. In 2015, longtime Big Bird puppeteer Carol Spinney revealed that he received a letter from NASA asking if he would be interested in joining the space program, take a flight in the shuttle, and orbit the Earth. It was all part of a larger push to integrate civilians into the space program and make it more popular. Using a beloved TV character was just another way to get kids interested in space, not unlike NASA's plans for McAuliffe, just with a bit more whimsy. Clearly, though, the plan fell through, as neither Spinney nor his famous character were present on the Challenger when it exploded, although the reasons have never been fully explained. The effort wasn't even public knowledge until it was revealed in the documentary I Am Big Bird.
We were filming Sesame Street the day that it went up. They stopped production and said, "We're going to watch the takeoff."
Spinney suspected that there just wasn't enough room for an 8-foot-tall puppet on a space shuttle where every square inch was valuable, though there's been no official confirmation of that theory. NASA officials have admitted that the talks involving Big Bird did take place in some capacity, but they merely revealed that they weren't approved. The Challenger's crew compartment reached a peak altitude of 65,000 feet. That's a lot of time for it to accelerate before colliding with the ocean at 207 miles per hour. In terms of force, that translates to 200 Gs. That's well past the limits for the cabin to survive as anything more than rubble, and the impact was also violent enough that the crew's remains couldn't be identified as human, and that's without even getting into how the rest of the shuttle disintegrated. And yet, somehow, a soccer ball managed to survive all of that destruction. Crew member Ellison Onizuka had brought the ball along because it belonged to his daughter Janelle, who played on the soccer team at Clear Lake High School in Houston. It was somehow recovered from the wreckage and returned to Onizuka's family, with Janelle later recalling to ABC's Houston affiliate KTRK in 2017. It was amazing the condition it was in after the explosion. But the story doesn't end there. The ball was put on display at Janelle's school, and then 3 decades later, another astronaut, Jane Kimbrough, had a daughter who was attending that very same school. Kimbrough offered to take up an object for the school when he flew to the International Space Station, and the soccer ball got that honor. It was photographed floating aboard the ISS in 2017.